Okay, starting the lecture on race and ethnicity one more time. I just discovered I had not hit the record button. Now we are recording. So, race is something that Americans have been very reluctant to talk about. Although lately, as we all know, it's a topic of conversation at all levels of society, in the government, in institutions of the government, the police force, educational system, the economy, even religion. We saw Joel Osteen uh, taking part in a peaceful protest in downtown Houston. Joel Osteen from the mega church here in Houston, very well known evangelist. Um, and why have we suddenly been talking about this? Well, unless you have been living under a rock, you know that George Floyd died May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer who was restraining him with a technique that involved putting pressure on a person's neck until they become compliant. He kept this up for 9 minutes. Floyd said multiple times, "I can't breathe." Uh, and even addressed the officer as sir while he was doing it. So finally he died. And there's been outrage among, particularly the African American community, for many others who see the injustice in how African Americans have been treated, and other people have been treated as well by the police. They propose to abolish police forces altogether, defund them, shift their funding into other types of programs. Remains to be seen what will come of those initiatives, but in any event, it sparked global protests, and some protests were rather, had an element of violence. There was some looting. It seemed to me, from what I could tell, what I saw was opportunistic looting. People that were not part of the protests were taking advantage of the fact that the police were occupied in the protests that were popping up all over major cities, including where the largest group, for instance, Black Lives Matter movement, had organized the demonstrations, marches, rallies. So, race is considered by sociologists to be a social construction. You've had a little exposure to the idea of social constructivism, the idea that many aspects of our social life and the world we perceive as being real and fixed in its way for all time is not. It's a human product. A group of people decided that something was the case, something was true, something that had to be done, had to be done in a particular way, became habitual, became ingrained. We learned it from our forebears, we learned it in schools, from our religious leaders, from the leaders of the institutions that have power over us in the form of an ideology. Um, so it's transmitted through these cultural and social institutions. So, social construction. Why would one say it's a social construction that has no basis in physical, that is, biological reality? Well, the science tells us that there's more genetic variation within a given so-called race than there are between the races. Um, I'm not going to try to give you the analogy that explains that concept, but you can think of eye color. You can find all eye colors in all races, but some groups of people might have less variation, and typically these people with less variation have a lot in common. They may be the same so-called racial group. Um, the differences between us are literally skin deep. Skin color and, to a certain extent, hair texture is the only physical thing that might differentiate these groups of people that we call races. And really, a race, it really just indicates where your ancestors, your distant ancestors, lived the longest. Where did our distant ancestors live the longest? Well, you don't have to accept the theory of the evolution of Homo sapiens humans, our species, from a common ancestor that we share with other primates as well as some other extinct human cousins. But I'm going to speak as if that is the case. word now. All the evidence, and the evidence now is better than it used to be because paleontologists, archaeologists, geneticists have become very good at decoding all the information, a lot of information from finds of very old bones, fossil bones, millions of years old to hundreds of thousands of years old to more recent bones of human beings and our cousins. So all the evidence points to our origins in Africa. All human beings apparently came from Africa. We evolved in Africa. There were other cousins, members of the same genus of Homo, that evolved before we did and left Africa long before we did, populated Europe before Homo sapiens began to leave Africa, which began 80,000 years ago. There are other numbers out there. It's something which one can never be sure about. Writing did not exist at this point. No one kept a record. Now it's possible to sequence the entire genome from an ancient bone, from a tooth, from a jaw. We're also working on protein structures because proteins are sturdier than the DNA that makes up our genome. However, you probably have seen ads for groups like 23andMe and Ancestry that you can get a genetic test from certain parts of your DNA sequence to indicate your origins more deeply or than people related to you now in many cases. For instance, 23andMe, I'm not sure of the others, they will give you the percentage of your genome that you have inherited from non-human cousins, Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals, also the Denisovans, who are known only from one find in a valley in the Denisova River Valley in Russia. All humans, unless you are from and have always stayed in sub-Saharan Africa in your family, not just you have some Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in your gene. Apparently, it's some now. Because we share a genus, but we're a different species in those, producing viable offspring was rare, but it did happen. If Neanderthals and human Homo sapiens looked much alike, you would probably, if a Neanderthal were alive today, and they're all gone, by the way, extinct about 12,000 years ago, possibly killed and eaten by our kind. If you saw one walking down the street, you might notice they looked a bit different, but not so much different you would think of them as anything other than a person. They had larger brains than we did. They were very clever folks. They apparently had beliefs about the afterlife. We found Neanderthal burials where objects were put with the corpse of the deceased that indicate some belief that something is going to happen beyond the death of that person. So anyway, just to give you an example, I'm going to share some of my DNA ancestry, show you my Denisovan components. I had a test done as part of a project that's still ongoing, organized by National Geographic. A lot of the DNA databases that are accumulated by 23andMe, for instance, you pay to have your genes sequenced. So a lot of people can't afford this, particularly in many parts of the world. National Geographic, the Genome 2.0 project, wanted to get a picture of the entire human population globally. So in many parts of the world, they gave it to us. In the developed, affluent West, the United States, Europe, you bought them. I bought one, and my results came back. They don't tell you who you might be related to and how closely of people living today. There are is other information you get from them, including the deep history of your ancient ancestors. So I will show you a little bit of that once I share the screen. Okay, you should be seeing your ancestral journey here. You see there's been over a million participants. So my deep ancestry, 100,000 years ago. I'll show you that in a moment. Here's my hominin ancestry. Hominins is a grouping that includes Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, Homo denisova. I'm not sure of the species name. There's Homo floresiensis, it's hobbit, and it's called because because it's small. So, as you can see here, possibly I will zoom in a bit for this. 2.2% of my genes came from Neanderthals, 2.6% from Denisovans. It's a little above average for both, particularly the Denisovans. Now, overall, there's more Neanderthal DNA in our body than this. If I have 2.2% and you have 2.2%, that's not the same 2.2% because genes get sorted. It's believed that a predisposition toward depression, towards addiction to nicotine, may be part of our heritage from Neanderthals, as well as the immunity to some viral diseases. So, benefits and costs there. So, it also will tell you something about how wanderings. Now, they do the Y chromosome for the father's line, the X chromosome for the mother's line. Look at my father's line because that's a little more interesting. Now, as I think I mentioned, people began leaving Africa at least 80,000 years ago. The people my father and I were descended from left later than that, it appears. So I'm going to reduce this again so we can see everything on the screen. These things represent specific gene markers, mutations. Mutations occur primarily up until the past maybe 200 years ago as a result of radiation breaking DNA, damaging DNA in some way. Our body, our cells have a mechanism for repairing damaged DNA. It doesn't always get it right. So this radiation is in the form of cosmic rays. These are charged particles streaking from space through our atmosphere. They can be detected with a plain old radiation detector. I almost said a Geiger counter. You don't see those as often anymore. During the Cold War, when we lived in fear of a sudden nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, a lot of people had Geiger counters because you wanted to be able to tell when it was safe to come out of your shelter. You could buy shelters from this radiation fallout in Sears stores and department stores. It was, I wanted one. I was a little kid. I'm not sure we couldn't afford one, and I don't think my parents would have bought one. So these are markers. So when there's a mutation that doesn't, in a part of your DNA that doesn't affect anything important, because most of your DNA does not seem to do a whole lot, you will pass that mutation on to your child, and they will pass it on to theirs. Eventually, maybe there's another mutation. So over time, you build up a series of mutations, and you can be put into categories based upon these markers. This is the most recent marker. So what we have here, just looking at the markers, when did this mutation occur? It's more than 100,000 years old, occurred in Africa. A lot of this is still speculative, but based on that, this is where that mutation spread over this period. They don't have the spread for everyone. Here's another mutation. It's still in East Africa, 80,000 years ago. Still another, but this one they're finding up into Turkey, Anatolia. The Middle East, this is actually Turkey up here. This is, I don't know if this is Saudi or Yemen. 70,000 years ago is when they dated this particular mutation, a little bit more spreading into North Africa. 50 to 55,000 years ago, further into North Africa. So humans began moving into Europe 80,000 years ago. My father's people were not among them, apparently. Recently, it's 40,000 years ago. They're still in Africa, North Africa, maybe some of the Middle East. 24,000 years ago, they are still up here in this area. Egypt, perhaps, Ethiopia, Tunisia, but haven't made the move into Europe. All right, here they're headed for Europe. 22,000 years. This is Turkey. So this mutation is first found. Now, what this is telling us, what are the oldest bones in which they've sequenced of DNA and found this? 18,500 years, still more or less in Turkey, but then spreading into Europe through Greece. Age to be determined. It's not clear. But the Balkans, for the most, Greece and the Balkans, perhaps over to Sicily. It's interesting that there's that because the Greeks colonized Sicily as well as the Balkans. And then finally, here it says researchers discovered a member of this lineage at a Neolithic burial site, the cave in Spain. So it's not shown on this, but there we go. Heat map. This will tell me where I have the most in common with people, so to speak, genetically. On my father's side, just in that chromosome. So we see it darkest in Greece and the Balkans, also some spots in Russia and so forth, and still North Africa and East Africa. So that is me. You continue sharing and start the lecture proper. I'm using this lecture in both my intro to sociology and social problems. So this, again, to back up, sociological definition of race. It's a social construction that has been used to classify people hierarchically on the basis of real or perceived physical and biological differences. Remember the hierarchy, classifying on the basis of some variable. Typically, this is done by the dominant group in a society. And typically they classify themselves as members of the most advanced race. In the ancient world, race could just really mean the part of the country you were from. That's how it was used in Greece and Rome and so forth. And for a long time, the modern notion of race as something biological came up, is less than 300 years old. And Europeans created that ideology in the original categories that were a little unwieldy, the Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid type races. Those were the three that someone whose name escapes me believed covered them all. However, it's far more complex than that, of course. Particularly because it's not something that is real in the sense that, for instance, the fact that we have 5 toes is real. So, one of the assignments for a paper that at least one of the classes has is part 2, perhaps part 3, part 2 of a documentary called Race, The Power of an Illusion. If you have time, and this can be streamed through the library, take a look at part 1. It goes through all of the lack of any genetic basis for racial differences. It revolves around high school students in a classroom that are getting genetic tests on the spot and getting sequenced And they're assigned, among other things, to guess who they have most in common with. So they all group up and think, with the people they think they're going to be most alike, and it turns out to be completely different than that. They're pretty sure. So anyway, so ethnicity is another term. Ethnicity relates to culture, and that's really specifically what country, what culture your ancestors come from. Ethnicity is usually within one of these racial groupings. For instance, you have Polish Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans. The concept of ethnicity is kind of fading, but during this era, when it was common for the dominant group to recognize others as Italian Americans, Irish Americans, there was this group, the dominant group, they didn't think they had any ethnicity. If someone thinks they don't, that's how they're probably a member of the dominant group. Okay, so um, in the dominant groups, as I said, they do this assigning to the racial categories. In New York, in the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, a common belief was Jews were a separate race. The Irish were a separate race. That notion went back into England. The English felt that the poor were genetically inferior, not quite a separate race, but genetically, biologically different than their betters, those who controlled the country and had a lot of money and land. Um, there is an interesting book, and I'm going to be talking about several books. I'll write from the lecture in just a moment to discuss that. A book called White Trash, The Hidden History of Class in America by Nancy Eisenberg, where she details the planning that went into rounding up the poor and the troublemakers in England and sending them to the colonies, to the Western Hemisphere, to the New World, to act as what they called manure for the New World. It was not uncommon if a woman in England was convicted of prostitution, she would be sent to Jamaica, where the British had sugar plantations, many of which many of the workers on the plantations were African slaves. The British practiced slavery, as did many other nations, within the last 300 years. The United States, of course. Um, uh, let's see here. In this book, you cannot see racism from slavery to advanced capitalism. Carter A. Wilson. He basically gives the English the credit for creating racism as we know it in the United States. I'll talk about that more later. Credit, should have said blame. Credit was meant sarcastically. Okay, so some information that I just shared with you. Stereotypes, some definitions which you may or may not be familiar with. Ideas about groups of people. They can be positive or negative. There are positive stereotypes. But positive stereotypes can be as harmful as well. For instance, there is a stereotype out there, and it's an acceptable one, apparently, to a certain extent, that Asians are better at math than other groups. What if you are Asian and you're no good at math? How are you going to feel when you hear that? I mean, it's you probably see what I mean. Prejudice is by thoughts or attitudes that involve thinking some other group, a racial group, an ethnic group, is inferior to you. It's a flawed belief. It's not correct. Nevertheless, it's possible that you just think it, or you may act on it. You may treat people differently. You may decline to hire someone because of their perceived race. If you're doing that, putting your prejudice into action, you are practicing. That's discrimination. It's possible, given that we have institutional racism in this country and other forms of institutionalized discrimination, you might work in a particular organization whose rules somehow disadvantage one group at the expense of another. And you may not be prejudiced in your own mind, but by carrying out these rules, you are part of a system that discriminates. So you can engage in discriminatory behavior without being prejudiced. An idea that's important these days is intersectionality. You probably hear that if you've been following a lot of the discussions among the experts, writers, scholars, activists that have been interviewed on television in the last few weeks. It's not simply one aspect of your category you've been sorted into, because people have been thrown into several categories. Doing that kind of thing, it seems like humans have been doing that since we have been around. Drawing boundaries between groups, claiming those boundaries mean something, and sometimes using those boundaries as a reason to exclude someone from access to symbolic or material resources. So we have race, we also have social class or economic status, then there's sexual orientation. So all these things intersect. So all gay males are not going to have the same experience. African American gay males, Asian gay males are going to have a different life experience and life chances than Caucasian gay males. So if you are a transgendered African American female, your life experiences are going to be different than a cisgendered African American female. Trans means other, cis means the same. You take chemistry, organic chemistry, you will get cis and trans until you can't stand it. That's the term. They're Latin terms, and in chemistry they're used to say what side of a ring, a molecule that has a ring structure in it, what side of that ring is a particular functional group on. Don't worry about that if you're not a chemist and don't plan to be one. If so, you'll encounter it. But cis and trans, cis on this side, for instance, I identify as a male. I was labeled as a male when I was born, so that makes me cisgendered. Okay. Some other ideas: matrix of oppression and matrix of advantage. These are how these other dimensions of inequality really intersect and interact. A term you'll hear a lot of is white privilege. That's the benefits that white people get simply because they're part of the dominant group, and they are many. They've reacted poorly to having those justifiably eroded and weakened. It's many have it's driven the political choices many people make, and in my view and many people's view, what has happened to a lot of the people who are angry about this has to do more with economics and globalization than it does with privileges or advantages being given to others. So I'll leave that for another discussion. White privilege. There's also the notion of white fragility, the idea that white people do not want to talk about race. But many of us don't want to talk about race, at least. So, racism. Right. That's when racial advantages are built into social structures and processes and have a definite impact on the allocation of these goods, resources, opportunities, and rewards insofar as the dominant group tends to have a greater share relative to their numbers than other groups. So there's no nobody's found a single reason why people might feel might might be racist, might have the idea that other groups are by nature inferior to them, not as good as them, not simply different, but inferior. Undoubtedly, a lot of it has to do with what we learn when we are very young from our parents. If your parents act in ways which might be perceived from another perspective as racist, you're more likely to do so as well. At least up to a point. We have free will. Many young people rebel against their parents, and it certainly would be something worth rebelling against. A good friend of mine in Dallas is African American, grew up poor in South Dallas. Um, we were talking about what I will call the N word. And he told me that growing up, you had to be able to tell when someone was using that word in order to hurt you and when they were just using it because that's how they grew up talking, because they can be two different things. And it was vital that you know the difference. Uh, because knowing that kind of tells you where you are socially if you're in this company of others, particularly if you're interacting with whites in the white world, which white people, well, we encounter that. So I already mentioned part of this. It used to be believed there was a scientific, biological, physical basis to racial differences. That kind of thinking really kind of coalesced an idea of social Darwinism, not only to explain racial difference, but to explain why people were poor. People were poor because it was genetic. They had they were inferior genetically. They weren't as biologically fit as the wealthy. The same was applied to people of color and others. The notion that um, and obviously the group that is most fit is the one in power who are advancing these notions. You may think the term social Darwinism had something to do with Charles Darwin. Well, Darwin did advance the idea of survival of the fittest in the natural world, and fitness was a matter of biology and genetic ability to adapt to environments and to compete with others for these resources. But he did not say anything about social Darwinism. That came from Herbert Spencer, a man that is sometimes considered a sociologist, sometimes a philosopher, but it's a rather odious ideology which still rears its head occasionally. Charles Murray is someone who's writing in the contemporary world that wrote a book called The Bell Curve, trying to explain racial differences along these lines, and it caused tremendous amount of controversy. There was a eugenics movement. Eugenics is not the ability, a program for breeding, genetically selecting people, allowing certain people to pass their genes on, preventing other peoples from passing their genes on in order to reduce social problems. Because it was believed many social problems were rooted somehow in genetics. As I mentioned, poverty, but also promiscuity, criminal criminal activity. These things at one time or another were blamed on genetics. We felt that if you could prevent a criminal from having children, you might end up reducing the crime rate ultimately. There were eugenics programs tried in the United States. One target were prostitutes who had too many children. They often were sterilized, so they would not pass on this predilection for sexual deviance to any more children. And what happened was scientists provided a body of justification for racist practices and for racism. But fortunately, few people hold that to be validated. More definitions. You can read that. I believe I just defined it. Racism justifies the belief that of superiority or inferiority. Colorism is something people are talking about more. Within a particular group, differences in skin tone can be used in some sort of hierarchical ranking. There's been quite a bit of research on the different outcomes for people with different skin tones within the same racial grouping when they go to court for sentencing, for instance. Let's see, this article published in the American Journal of Sociology in 2016, A Punishing Look, Skin Tone and Afrocentric Features in the Halls of Justice. Oddly, people who appeared to be white in terms of skin tone but had Afrocentric features, in other words, maybe they look a little mixed race, they might get stiffer sentences from white judges than others. So they discuss the reasons for that in this article. If you're interested in that, I can give you the full reference or email you a PDF of the article. But I have to warn you, if you ask for it, most sociological research is done using mathematical models, statistical methods, a hypothesis that's advanced, a way of operationalizing the claims that are made. That means they determine a way to measure a verbal statement, a verbal situation, and you almost need a math degree to understand it. So, okay, culture of prejudice, that is again the idea that prejudice and racism is embedded in our culture. It seems to be institutional racism. That's what is embedded in social institutions and comes from the normal operation of those institutions. For instance, there are cases of African American police officers shooting involved in unjustified uses of force, including shooting, killing other African Americans. So there appears to be a culture of policing that leads to some of these incidents. It's not strictly white racism, overt white racism, as was so often the case in the past. Some examples of institutional racism are particularly evident in the area of real estate, residential segregation, where people live, where it's possible to live. We are more segregated as a society now than we were 30 years ago. So how is it that this works? Well, the first it has nothing to do with real estate, racial profiling. That's where police officers, police departments may be more likely to stop an African American or Latino driver than they are a white driver. It's a profile which tends to associate with certain groups that links them to possible criminality, which is also unjustifiable. The stop and frisk campaign in New York City that Mayor Giuliani instituted, where it was part of the war on drugs. I'll talk more about that later. They tended to spend more time in African American areas. And in Manhattan, they still tended to stop and frisk African Americans at a higher rate compared to their numbers than whites. Even though, and they were looking, this is part of the war on drugs, they were searching people for drugs. Most drug users in the United States are white people. That is indisputable. So segregation is just physical separation of two groups. It can be in the workplace, can be in a movie theater, water fountains, separate water fountains in the South. I know you've heard about this or not. That would be marked, separate entrances to facilities, separate hotels, and separate neighborhoods. Redlining is an outlawed practice. It's still probably practiced under the table. That's where banks refuse to make home loans for households and businesses in a particular part of town, where, for instance, the designated minority group lives. That's illegal now. Racial steering is something that real estate agents engage in. They might show houses to an African American family only in African American neighborhoods, even if they had the credit and the down payment to own houses in any part of the city. But they are steered to these neighborhoods. That's very common. There are still periodically groups do a sort of an audit on real estate practices, and they will send two couples to the same realtor with identical credit scores, identical job statuses, and so forth, and evaluate if they are treated differently than usually. Okay, the Black Lives Matter movement, you've heard a lot about that. They've organized a lot of big protests that have arisen and continue globally, uh, sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, native Houstonian George Floyd. This is not the right lecture. So I'm going to stop recording and sharing. Okay, we're back. I said I would just want to talk about some books, and I give you a look at what I will be talking about. I'm about to talk about an idea advanced by sociologist W.B. Du Bois. Many of you may have heard of him. I'm going to talk about double consciousness. He wrote about that in this book, the Souls of Black Folk. He was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. Some say that he's actually the founder of American sociology, but he doesn't get credit for that because he of the prejudice of the time. He was writing and working during the era that I'll describe in a moment, known as the Jim Crow era in the South, when African Americans were restricted from a lot of opportunities and resources and so forth. And this was a legal sort of discrimination that was embedded in the law codes of southern states. Du Bois grew up in Massachusetts. His mother was a servant for some wealthy folks, and this person, and his mother would take him along sometimes. And the person that she worked for recognized that he was an extremely smart young man and arranged to have him go to the same private school that her children went to. And so he grew up with some advantages, some privileges in Massachusetts. And it wasn't until he had finished his doctorate and began to look for a teaching position that he experienced racism. He could only get a position at a historically black university, and that was well, forgotten now. The Morehouse College, I think, in Atlanta, but I'm not certain. In any case, he was, because of racial prejudice among sociologists and people in the field, he was seldom he was seldom invited to conferences and meetings and so forth. He was just more or less an outsider. But he did the first large-scale statistical sociological research in the United States. He was hired by a group of perhaps well-meaning, somewhat racist, affluent people in Philadelphia who wanted to eliminate or significantly reduce crime in Philadelphia. And they believed it was concentrated in the African American community. So he was hired to do an in-depth study of of that community so that they could use this information to change things in a way that Du Bois would probably not have advocated. He knew what was going on. He knew what these people really, what their end game was. But he needed the work, and he thought he could produce something that had value beyond the purposes to which it might be put. Okay, that was this book, The Philadelphia Negro. So I've read some of this, but this book was published about 3 years ago. The Scholar Denied, which tells the story of how Du Bois was shorted and slighted and just ignored by many of the leading sociologists in the United States. And it makes the case that he really should be considered the founder of American sociology. So, on the subject of institutional racism, this is an excellent book. Some of you may have read the article about how affirmative action programs have benefited white people. They weren't called affirmative action programs, but they amounted to that insofar as they were government housing programs that for World War II era workers that shut out the African Americans who were also working in the factories in which the people who were eligible for these first shot at, or any shot at purchasing homes that had been built from the color of law. So, subtitle: A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. This goes into depth on real estate practices and how many of the approved codes of conduct for realtors embedded racism. So I'm about to, I was on the verge of, in the old lecture, that's when I knew it was the wrong one, talk about this book by Massey and Denton, American Apartheid, Segregation in the Making of an Underclass, of the Underclass. You may have heard the term underclass. I don't hear it much anymore. Anyway, it basically referred to the poorest among us, those people with no money at all, people living on the street, and poor workers, poor people on public assistance. And obviously, pardon me, they did not live in the affluent neighborhoods of our cities. Right about the impact on social life of concentrating the poorest people all in the same area, systematically denying them opportunity. So, share the screen again. Okay. Double consciousness. That was W.E.B. Du Bois' idea that African Americans in the Jim Crow South had to really be two people. They had to have two senses of themselves. Now, Du Bois was influenced by Max Weber and understanding what action means for the person doing the acting and so forth. And also Weber's concept called Verstehen, empathic understanding. There's no good English translation, which is understanding what the world is like from that person's point of view, getting inside their head. And our sense of ourselves and how we should behave in all this, we learn as the socialization process as we grow up from our parents initially, our siblings, our peers. We get a sense of our who we are, our identity from others. Well, for African Americans, they would get that from their parents, their siblings, their community, the church, but they also were getting it from elsewhere, from the dominant white community. And they had to be a different person around if they were interacting with those folks. So there was kind of a split in their identity, in their sense of self, which created psychic burdens on the sense of two-ness, the double consciousness, he calls it, that white Americans had no idea about. They didn't have to be two people. And be ready to switch back and forth at a moment's notice and deal with the contradictions that might entail. So, important idea. Elijah Anderson. Did I bring his book over here? No, I did not. Well, anyway, Streetwise, Race, Class, and Change in an Urban Community, 1990. A participant observation study of interactions between members of a neighborhood which had been historically African American but was no longer, was becoming gentrified. Affluent whites were moving in, and then another part of this historically African American part of Philadelphia, which had deteriorated because, well, the economy had changed in many, for the most part. A thriving African American middle class had developed in Philadelphia during the era of the shortly before the Second World War, and especially after, when Philadelphia had many shipyards, steel mills, a lot of heavy industry. And many of the jobs in these places were unionized, paid well. These were the days when you could graduate from high school, or maybe even not actually, get a job in a factory, join the union, get guaranteed raises year after year, according to a contract, and earn enough money to be able to buy a house, buy a new car every few years, go on vacations, raise a family, have a wife that stays at home and raises the kids without a college education, sometimes without a high school education. Those days are gone, of course. And a lot of that had to do with the outsourcing of heavy industry, the economic collapse in the 1970s, which we haven't really come back from, a significant way, really. Economically, this is a far more unequal society than it was in the era. We'll talk about that, at least in my sociology, 1301, more length later. So Elijah Anderson was basically on the streets. That's participant observation. You are observing what's going on and participating in that. He maybe wasn't strictly a participant, but he was definitely an observer, and others knew he was there and what his purpose was, disguising that. But the book that he published about this research, Streetwise, so you have the two neighborhoods. One is gentrifying with affluent young and older whites moving in. The other is more rundown because the people who built these old Victorian houses in both parts of the city, the gentrifying and the non-gentrifying, were, they had passed on. They might have worked in the factories. They might have been doctors or accountants or some professional job within the African American middle class in that community. But they'd passed on, and as a result of economic opportunities drying up, their children were not able to keep up the houses to the extent that they had been. And in the part of this neighborhood where you had the larger and solid old Victorians that had fallen on hard times, people moved in to rehabilitate, remodel, and they were not the people that had been in the community, of course. When this kind of thing happens, and it happens here in Houston, it happens everywhere. When this happens, property values go up. When property values go up, taxes go up, and these tax rates may be applied to parts of the city which have not seen any economic advance in the past 20, 30, 40 years. So it becomes impossible, perhaps, the same rates will not apply. But what will happen is people who may have been renting a house or an apartment or something in this part of the city that is gentrifying, suddenly the costs go up because the property around them is worth so much more and everything is taxed at that rate. They're forced to move to a cheaper neighborhood. This is happening in Houston. It happens all over the United States at this point, possibly the world, where people they're moved, they leave the area they've grown up in, schools they've attended, and they're concentrated. Poverty ends up concentrated in a particular area of town. So Anderson observed how people interacted on the street. He observed that, for instance, the people that the gentrifying folks, typically white, they were through their body language and other things, they were sending signals to African American, particularly young African American males, signals that could be read a mile away, saying, "I think you are dangerous." And for instance, a woman might clutch her purse as she passes a group of men. This was so obvious that sometimes even other men would notice this and say, no, I'm not like that. I'm not a gang member or whatever that might be. So anyway, so these messages, these are from others. These are the things that give us our sense of who we are, what we are capable of what kind of person we can be, what others think of us. And when you're sending these negative signals to people, quite often they're going to internalize them. So it's another form of the social construction of our social reality. Things we do have an impact. And maybe if we were aware of it, we would not behave in that manner, but we do. So he wrote other books, another one about Philadelphia. He's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. So he's in Philadelphia a lot. It was the Cosmopolitan Canopy, where he wrote about places where people of different races interacted together in a fairly stress-free, frictionless, happy surroundings. Concerts, some street festivals of one sort or another. One example he gave, if you know Philadelphia, you know the Reading Avenue Terminal, I believe it's called. It's an old train terminal, but it's been converted into small shops, restaurants, and it's a must-see if you visit Philadelphia, the Reading Terminal. But that's one example. So the Cosmopolitan Canopy, it's a hopeful take on race relations in America. It shows how it can be, could be, but in most cases is not. So this was where I broke off. The Black Lives Matter movement. You've heard a lot about them recently. They've organized a lot of the protests, demonstrations, rallies, marches that have erupted in the wake of George Floyd of Houston's killing in Minneapolis. Floyd had not been in Minneapolis that long. His family still lives here in Pearland, in Missouri City. So he has deep roots here. The grandmother of the head of our sociology department had him as a student in school, or another adjunct in the sociology department was one of his classmates. So he is remembered here. But anyway, Black Lives Matter formed in the aftermath of another killing of a young black man, Trayvon Martin, in Florida. A man named George Zimmer killed Mr. Martin, he was a teenager, because he was frightened because of the loud music coming from their car, apparently. There were various stories. But Zimmer was acquitted on the basis of the law in Florida called stand your ground. Even if you can retreat from a dangerous situation, you are not likely, you don't have to. If you are armed, you can protect whatever it is you think you need to protect. In that case, I guess he wanted to protect his well-being and his safety by killing this person. Later, he faced federal civil rights charges, and he did suffer some consequences. But he's back out again. But I believe he went back to jail for assaulting his wife. The last I heard of him, he was trying to sell the gun he used to kill Trayvon Martin on eBay. eBay learned about this and yanked the listing. Anyway, so the use of lethal force against an African American who may not necessarily be that threatening, is probably the most extreme form of racial profiling we have. It's more likely to happen to an African American than to a white individual. Latinos also suffer from this. The protests in Austin that in the wake of George Floyd's death also had a focus, a man named Michael Ramos, who had been killed by the police. And it's unclear what the circumstances were. Quite often, this is common in Chicago. Something goes wrong with the police body cameras, or they forget to turn them on whenever these things happen. So there's no record. If there's no one around with a cell phone to film it, it's not going to be documented. It's not going to be. And if we didn't have those, there'd be a lot of this happening. Many people are certain that. But the Black Lives Matter movement is more or less of a coalition formed in 2012. It's not one specific organization. There are many that come together that advocate for change, social justice. They've also been focused on the what's called mass incarceration, a consequence of the war on drugs that began in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. When First Lady Nancy Reagan said it's as easy as just saying no. The laws were changed to include mandatory minimum sentences and so forth, where a judge had no discretion in what you were sentenced to if you were convicted of a drug crime. You also may have heard that for the longest time, it's only recently been changed, possession of powder cocaine carried a lighter sentence than possession of crack cocaine. Well, powder cocaine tends to be used by white people more than crack cocaine, which is associated with African American communities and other people of color. You would, go to jail for sure if you were caught with any amount of crack during this period. The law has been changed because this was an obvious inequity based on race. War on drugs also led to the militarization of the police. They were getting heavier, the military type equipment. You notice that they don't look like the police in a movie from the 1950s anymore. They look more like someone you'd see in Fallujah, in Afghanistan, Iraq. But that's the way it's gone. So, war on drugs put a lot of focus on ending drug abuse by cutting off the supply of drugs, arresting people using them, arresting people selling them, and they focused this policing on communities of color, despite the fact, as I already said, most drug users are white. Now, one aspect of it, if you're convicted of a felony and you're released, you probably cannot vote. You can in some states. You're going to have trouble getting a job. You are going to have a number of troubles. In some cases, you are on probation or parole and you are prohibited from being out after a certain time of night or being a certain distance from your home. This causes a lot of issues for people who have been released. They are not really, they served their sentence, but they are not free. The civil rights movement was a lot about getting the right to vote. But if you're arrested for a felony, you're going to lose that. So that is why Michelle Alexander, an attorney, I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment, wrote this book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. What's the age of colorblindness? Well, the era since President Obama was elected. I'll talk more about that in a moment. When I get to this, racism without racists. Colorblind racism and the persistence of inequality in America. So, Michelle Alexander. If you've seen the film 13th, you've seen her interview. If you haven't seen 13th, I recommend. It's available on Netflix. All right, let's bring it back to the page there. All right. Okay. Some of the most high-profile police killings in the last 6 years. Eric Garner in New York in July 2014 died after a chokehold was used. He was arrested for selling single cigarettes rather than packs of 20, which you could only do if you're a clerk, a business that has a license to sell them. The coroner just ruled his death was a homicide, but nobody was indicted for that. Michael Brown, in August 2014, was shot several times by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. Brown allegedly stole some cigars. He was shot 12 times after a fight, of alleged struggle of some sort. But witnesses, not all witnesses, many said his hands were in the air when he was shot, which led to the hands up, don't shoot pose in many of the protests and the slogan. Freddie Gray, April 2015, Baltimore. He was arrested for possession of an illegal knife, put in a police van. Somehow his back was broken on the way. Or before. It's hard to say. 6 officers indicted on manslaughter. And the whole incident led to several days of rioting in the streets, much more so, much more intense than we saw anywhere in the Floyd protests. So, and then finally, George Floyd, May 25th, 2020, already mentioned that. We all know about that. Unless we've been living under a rock. This could be a turning point in our discussion of race and race relations. All eyes are on the United States and this history of injustice in our society. So the protests are global in scope. I Can't Breathe became the hands up, don't shoot of this current era. I mentioned Jim Crow earlier, a system of racial discrimination. African Americans could not eat in the same restaurants as whites, drink from the same water fountains, attend the same showings of the film, often could not stay in the same hotel. There was riding in the back of the bus is the stereotype or the cliche about that era. And Alexander connects this war on drugs in the beginning to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy to break the stranglehold, if one could call it that, the dominance of the Democratic Party in the South by drawing people who were bigots, who were racists, and others, of course. I'm not trying to say every Republican in the South is a racist, but they drew many people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party by advocating getting tough on crime, fighting crime, law and order. Because at that time, in 1968, you not only saw a lot of unrest over the protests against the Vietnam War, but after Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, the African American communities in every major city erupted, and the National Guard was omnipresent in the cities for a while. There was a lot of what are called rioting, what some people would call rebellion or uprisings, depends on one's point of view. So, if you don't know that history, you might read a book called Eyes on the Prize. It's easy to read. It's not a technical sociological book, is what I meant by that. So, for Michelle Alexander, the war on drugs as we know it is simply a way of it's a strategy for maintaining white dominance and control of the African American era in this colorblind era. After President Barack Obama was elected, or Barack Obama was elected to the presidency, there were those who said, well, we're finally post-racial. We're beyond that. We're a colorblind society. Well, colorblind is what the problems didn't go away. What it meant was attention to the problems kind of faded. The problems were swept under the rug. Hence, Dr. Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Races. When it's sufficiently institutionalized, and I think I may have referred in a lecture to institutionalized racism. It's usually called institutional racism. The term we're hearing now is systemic racism. It's basically the same as institutional racism. So, one key aspect for Massey and Denton, two sociologists who studied housing and inequality in general, their book I just showed you, American Apartheid on Segregation, point out that the federal government had once been active in enforcing anti-segregation, open access legislation. It was, they believe it's a key aspect of racial inequality in the United States, simply where people live, because it determines what school you go to. It can determine the quality of the school based on the property taxes that are paid. And they, point out that the federal government, really kind of stopped paying much attention in the 1970s. And no other ethnic group has been as segregated in terms of urban residential segregation as African Americans. They also pointed out that American cities were more integrated. Integrated is the opposite of segregation. Segregation is the separation. Integration is the mixing. Were far more integrated in 1890 than they were in 1970. Mixed neighborhoods were the norm until 1900. Now, this Jim Crow system, oddly, some have made the case, a book called The Strange Career of Jim Crow by, just one moment. Well, I won't remember his name, possibly. It doesn't matter if the title's right. The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Something like Jim Crow existed in the North before the Civil War. Discrimination against people of color, although slavery was illegal, had become illegal. There was something like discrimination. And after the Civil War in the North, they began to pass vagrancy laws because many of the recently freed slaves went north to look for work, because what happened in the South was after Reconstruction was over, after the Republican and Democratic Party cut a deal to break an election deadlock, which involved removing federal troops from the South, the planter elite, the old white power structure, arose, came back. They never really went anywhere. They were just weakened by federal troops and federal attention. So they passed new laws regulating African Americans, the Black Codes, they were called. And the condition of African Americans became something similar to slavery, working for virtually no wages, if any, on the plantations that they had once been slaves on. Many went north. In the north, they passed laws to protect their own workers, whereby if you were in a city, in a state where these laws had been passed, or a city where they were passed, and you were questioned. You did not have a job. You did not have money. You did not have a place to stay. You found a place to stay. You were put in jail. Sometimes you could pay a fine and go elsewhere. But if you had no money for the fine, you were jailed. Sometimes you had both. So, um, anyway, so southern cities up until the 1890s really were actually more integrated than northern cities. So it's a mistake to think the North was particularly progressive about race relations simply because the North fought the southern states that had seceded in a war, and that Abraham Lincoln was from the North and emancipated slaves. Uh, so, oh, by the way, he emancipated initially only the slaves in the states that had seceded were freed. These states, except 3 states where slavery remained legal for several years into the Civil War, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, the slaves were not freed there as they were in the South, although they were freed in name at first because they were still, um, the South was still run by members of the Confederacy. So anyway, moving on. Some more information about residential segregation, how it concentrates this underclass, a term that isn't used very much anymore. But in the recent years, many areas that had become more integrated have been resegregated. Schools have never been as segregated as they are now in American cities. Bonilla Silva's book, The New Racism, he says for him, they've abandoned this biological justification, and now it's somewhat cultural. The idea of the culture of poverty was introduced in anthropology. It's kind of mutated into this form. So it's believed that African Americans are poorer because they're not working hard enough. They don't seek opportunities, don't study, what have you. It's cultural. It's still racism. So the fact that you know it's believed we're beyond this era, people don't pay attention. They're paying a lot of attention now, but there were new rationalizations put in place for white privilege, for the domination of most institutions by whites. 3 features of the new racism, according to Bonilla Silva: racial discourses and practices they're not obvious. They may be hidden, concealed, to read between the lines. Social problems are seldom discussed in terms of race because part of this white fragility is that whites become disturbed by this talk. They claim it contributes to reverse racism, feel they will be disadvantaged. And political programs have effects on racial matters. They're racializing, but usually it's not by design. It just happens to work that way. Institutional mechanisms are barely noticed that reinforce racism, perpetuate it. They're barely noticed by white Americans. And some of the things that you saw in the Jim Crow era are coming back. Here are some statistics. I will never ask you for numbers, statistics in an exam. I tend to shy away from them. This is depressing. Not much has changed. Nothing really has changed, except inequality in general, overall, is increased. Economic inequality. Uh, some more here today. Some more numbers, results of studies. Latinos are the nation's largest minority group. It won't be long before nationwide white Americans will no longer be the majority. In Texas, I believe they're not the majority now. Definitely not in Houston. Nobody is the majority. We are a minority city. We're a very diverse city. Um, You may not know that, in many households, a second language is spoken. Not surprisingly, the most common second language in the Houston area is Spanish. It would probably surprise you to learn that the second most common second language is Arabic. Now, one reason for that is Arabic. Many people from nations where their first language is not Arabic, but where Islam is the dominant or a very commonly practiced religion, need to know Arabic to read the Quran. So um, that's one reason Houston established an Arabic immersion school, an elementary school, where students would learn in English and in Arabic, because it's valuable to know another language, and particularly when it's a language that's understood by that many people in the Houston area. That school was the subject of many protests by those who were afraid this represented the advance of Islamic law or dilution of American values, something along those lines. It eventually faded away. The school is still uh, there, and it's locked down like the rest of the school. So I didn't say it's business as usual there. It's business as usual nowhere. Immigrants have been discriminated against for as long as there has been an English-based elite in the colonies, which is just about forever. There's been a strain of anti-immigrant nativism, it's called. Xenophobia is another word. Xeno means alien. Phobia is fear of the aliens, since the country was founded. And I neglected to mention, I should have mentioned, that the United States was founded as a slave society. There was no mention of slavery, particularly in the Constitution. However, there was that clause where slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of apportioning people to Congress. That was a compromise with the southern states to get them to agree to, the Constitution by giving them more representation. If only the non-slaves had been represented, they would not have had many people in Congress, and they were afraid that slavery might be abolished. I believe there was an amendment as well, which stated that slavery would not be abolished until a particular year. What is that? I do have that here. Um, let's see. Just one moment. So I have. Okay, in Article 1, Section 2, representation of taxes, 3/5 of those, quote, bound to service for a term of years. That is how they describe slaves in the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 9, prohibited action to ban slavery until at least 1808. The British banned slavery, I believe, in around 1830, 1831. And you may have heard of a debate about reparations for slavery, the idea that the let's say offspring, the descendants of freed slaves should be given some sort of cash payment for the fact that their ancestors were held in bondage and worked for no pay, were abused, and so forth. And that's an idea that is entertained periodically. And the British did pay after the abolition of slavery, but they paid the slave owners for loss of their property. And the British government didn't have that much money, so the British taxpayer, basically the poorer among them, paid for this over a period of years, reimbursed the slaveholders for loss of their property. So I just went back to that because of this phrase here, since the nation was founded. Some people say we were the United States had slaves, but no, we were a slave society. Cotton exports to Britain were our biggest exports. Granted, it benefited the southern states more than the north, and it led to a lot of tension between the north for a lot of reasons beyond the moral injustice of the institution. But as I mentioned earlier, Irish and Jews believed to be separate races. It was believed that Irish women were genetically predisposed to make better housekeepers than anyone else. So in New York City, if you were of that class that could hire a housekeeper, you wanted an Irish woman. The Irish men were stereotyped as well. If you want to see how that works to a certain extent and early nativism in action, watch the film Gangs of New York. I believe it's on Netflix. If not, it's on Amazon. They seem to trade off. Leonardo DiCaprio, um, Liam Neeson, uh, and Daniel Day-Lewis, among others that you will recognize probably from other films. Excellent film, very realistic, a lot of history dealt with in that one. So, well, one more historical note. The first slaves were brought there. Well, the first African Americans came to the United States as indentured servants. What is an indentured servant? Well, that's someone who has agreed to work for someone for no wages for a period of time in order to get passage on a ship from England to the colonies. These were usually arrangements made with the ship's captain by a go-between who would pay the ship's captain, and eventually the money would be funneled back to that person. 7 years was a typical length of time, after which you were free to do whatever. Typically, the idea was you would buy land, but often by the time after 7 years the land closest to you, it'd be more expensive than you were likely to be able to afford, so they went west. Anyway, African Americans came here initially as indentured servants, and then some of them began to be imported in bondage as slaves as well. There was an incident known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where some black and white indentured servants, some African slaves, and some Native Americans got together and decided that they could work together to make their situation a little better, particularly by freeing themselves. So they rebelled against the dominant whites there in Virginia. They were put down militarily, so it didn't work out well. But after that moment, they ceased to bring any African American indentured servants to the colonies. They were all brought in bondage as slaves. And they tended to start to give the white indentured servants some sort of privileges that the slaves did not have, to make sure they were aware that they were different. There were laws passed against interacting, particularly sexually, between the races, passed in the southern states, with very serious punishments, very violent punishments. If you want to read about that in more detail, this book, Racism, is the one that I mentioned earlier, is an excellent source. It begins with history and moves into how things operate now. So, immigrants have faced a lot of discrimination. They still do. Here's some charts. You don't need to worry about that. Just take a look at those. Deportations, border patrol budgets. Poverty rate. This is again where these material resources I'm talking about, where one is disadvantaged. Poverty rate. This means these are people below, families, percentage of families below the federal poverty level. I'll talk about that a little later. It's calculated in a very peculiar way. So you see the difference, Latinos, blacks, and whites. And then residential segregation. Your spatial isolation is segregation. Residential dissimilarity is integration. You can see what's happening. Incomes, the median income. Median means in the middle. So if let's say you want the median height, you've got 10 people in a room. Ask, what is the median height? You line them up from shortest to tallest. You pick the one in the middle. That's the median. Half are above, half are below. Now you need 11 to have one in the middle. Otherwise, 5 above, 5 below. And that middle's height is your median height. So the median is the middle. It's a better indicator for income than average is, because average can be biased by these extremely high incomes you see today's 1% of the households. So this is for males, this is for females, and this goes up through 2010. I'll try to update that at some point. It was probably, I think it's from census data, so that might be why it is. Civil rights movement more. If you don't know much about this, you should. It initially began in the South in the mid-1950s with a bus strike, which led to a boycott of the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama by African Americans led by Dr. Martin. Actually, okay, I'm jumping ahead of things. A key point, a watershed moment in the civil rights movement was the Supreme Court ruling Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. In 1896 or 1894, there was a ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson, related to rail cars. Rail cars were segregated. It was argued that this was discrimination that violated one of the constitutional amendments, the 14th, perhaps. And the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal, as long as the rail cars were basically the same, it was constitutional to have these separate but equal facilities. So that justified segregated schools for a long time. Supreme Court overturned this. Schools began to be integrated, and by force in many cases. The schools in the South and even in the North, parts of the North, many white parents were not happy about this. African American students from the beginning had to be escorted to school by members of the military, the U.S. military, or the National Guard. So later, 1955, just a year later, the Montgomery bus boycott began. That was when Rosa Parks, with the famous activist, refused to sit in the back of a bus, was arrested, led to a lot of protests around the country, demonstrations, young white college students going to the South to help register people to vote, to get the right to get to register as a voter in the South. Often you had to pass a very difficult test. For instance, you might have to name, I believe this was true in Alabama, you would have to know the names of every county clerk for every county in Alabama who could vote a registration card. Now, you might wonder, how could poor whites, uneducated whites, who were sharecroppers, as maybe just as many blacks were, how would they pass this? There was something called a grandfather clause. If your grandfather had been able to vote, then you could get a vote. You didn't have to take the test. Well, when these laws were passed in the early part of the Jim Crow era in the 1870s, late 1870s, early 1880s, 1890s, it was very unlikely that a freed slave's grandfather could vote because this grandfather would have been enslaved. So the grandfather clause only protected whites. Okay, enough about that. But when you hear the term grandfather clause or grandfathering somebody, remember that is its heritage. So, it's a commonly used term in organizations. bureaucracy. So anyway, the Civil Rights Act of '64 banned discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, national identity. Oddly, it's still, if it's ever up for renewal, it has been from time to time. The Voting Rights Act, I believe, is what I'm thinking of. It has been renewed from time to time, and it's recently been gutted by a Supreme Court decision. They've decided everything's fine in the South, so in many southern states, Texas included, the state governments have actively begun making it more difficult to vote, reducing the number of polling places, requiring more forms of identification beyond a voter registration card in order to vote. Other things that tend to disproportionately affect the poor, who are disproportionately African American and Latino. So, Civil Rights Act passed in '64 when Lyndon Johnson was president was another important milestone. Voting Rights Act was passed not long after that, and it created federal watchdogs that monitored the voting laws that were in effect in southern states, and they were frequently invalidated as discriminatory. Now that system is done. Nobody's watching this. One can still file a group can still file a lawsuit and fight the new regulations in court, and you're seeing that has been happening. But so far, not so good. Okay. Now, the nonviolent civil rights movement was very successful. Martin Luther King was influenced by Gandhi, nonviolent approach towards civil disobedience, but there were other groups that took more direct action. The Black Panthers, for instance, you may have heard of. They were about community self-defense. They appeared to be, perhaps they may have looked scary to the white community. They were armed to defend their communities, often against police violence. Once Richard Nixon became president, things began to happen to them. Many were arrested on trumped-up charges. Many were just. Fred Hampton in Chicago was murdered while he slept in his bed. These things tended to radicalize other people and contributed to the turmoil of the late 1960s. The Brown Berets was a similar group of Latinos. The American Indian movement, or you may not remember, you should read about them, and Wounded Knee, the second last stand at Wounded Knee. Here's some more just general terms which you may hear in discussions of intergroup relations. Genocide, deliberately wiping out a particular group. That's been happening in Myanmar, former Burma, who's the Rohingya. They've been forced to move or be killed. There are some parts of India where it's a good idea not to practice Islam. If you do, perhaps you should move to Pakistan. Expulsion is another way of the dominant group forcing the subordinate to leave a certain area. So that is common during the genocide, of course, Second World War, the Nazi campaign to wipe out Jews. Some were also expelled. The Jews were expelled from England. The Jews were expelled from Spain. Arabs were expelled from Spain unless they converted to Christianity, and then they were still suspect. Same with them. So this has happened in many countries for a long time. Segregation, I already mentioned. Pluralism is the idea that we're sort of a salad bowl, a mix of different cultures and races, and everyone retains their own identity. There's diversity. Assimilation is the idea that people who come here should become like the dominant group. They should learn those values, definitely learn the English language. This idea is not as dominant as it used to be. Amalgamation is the process by which a minority and majority group can combine to form a new group. That's the end. That's all I got. That, I think, was a lot. Sorry about that, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to stop the share now and say goodbye. And I can never remember the name of the author of the Ninja Prose. So I have to look that up. So, see ya.